my name's Kirk Stefke. I'm the VP of Technology here at CRM Science. I know a lot of you. I work with a lot of you, but it's also nice to meet a lot of you tonight. So thanks for coming out. I'll be your tour guide tonight on a topic that everyone either already knows or is going to get to know the love. I'm speaking to you right up front, our youngest member so far. We're talking Salesforce Process Automation, aka getting things done. Because as we all know, if you've ever used the platform, it's good at a lot of things, right? At the end of the day, people can go in, they can create records, they can look up data, they can modify things. It really helps a lot of businesses run. And there's also a lot of mundane, everyday processes that have to happen. I can go to a record, I can make those updates time and time again, but maybe I don't have to. Maybe there's ways to simplify this. And that's really what we're going to dive into today. These tools exist and they fall under a lot of different umbrellas within Salesforce. So what we want to get into is what's necessarily considered process automation under the Salesforce umbrella. What do they consider it? So each one of these blocks is something, one of those tools in our arsenal that we can use. On the left, we have the orange workflow with our legacy workflow rules. They have been around forever. They work extremely well, and you can do some very fancy things with them. They're limited in their actions, but I have to say, for what they can do, there's a lot of big businesses out there that use Salesforce that their entire business processes are run off the very simple things that it can do. As time has evolved, we've moved away from classic. We're now in the realm of Lightning, and with it are some new tools like Lightning Flow. And under that umbrella, there's really two cool tools there, Lightning Process Builder and Flow, not to be confused with the whole category name. Two distinct things that do very different things. We'll look at it more in a second. We'll go through examples of each of these and where you might use some versus the others. But Lightning Process Builder, to a lot of people, is a replacement to workflows. It doesn't have to be. It can be. Some things happen on workflows that don't happen in Process Builder and vice versa. There's pros and cons. And what you'll learn the whole way across here, there's two things that I'll need you to keep in mind as we go through tonight. Every one of these things is really cause and effect. It's, I want something or some things to happen when something else happens. I have a scenario that I'm building up for. Someone's creating a record or they're updating a record and it's meeting certain criteria, and I want something to happen, right? If you think about your everyday life, you're a Salesforce user, you're in an org, you're responsible for maintaining records. You're probably looking at those records and there's certain things that are going to trigger you to do things. A certain account field gets populated, now you need to call out to that account, right? Another field is going to be populated. You need to go into 5 other systems to update the Salesforce record, right? It's very manual, very tedious. We're going to be doing that same sort of thing here, but programmatically. Not programmatically in the development sense, but in the sense we can look at the records, build up criteria, and say, when this happens, do these really cool things for us. Each one of these offers those. So our third category is approvals, in the sense of approval processes. Now, we could really build out approval processes using workflow or process builder, but approval processes are one of those older things that have been around because it's a routine thing. A scenario I always use, if you think of the sales department and you have salespeople that are making deals, they're about to close an opportunity, but they can sweeten the pot with a certain discount. Well, maybe there's a rule in place that says they have to have the biz dev manager sign off on certain deals that have such a steep discount, right? So you could build logic in there to say, hey, sales manager, so-and-so is cutting someone a pretty sweet deal. Do you want to approve this before you let it go or not? And if you look at it, you're kind of building the same functionality over and over and over again. So what Salesforce did, they said, well, here's a feature you can use. It's really the same thing. Meet a certain condition, do something. It happens to be the same thing every single time. Let's just call it approval processes. So it's another way. It's been around forever, and they're fairly frequently used, just taking the complexity of building it yourself. Now, Einstein today, it is just that massive umbrella of all sorts of technologies. One thing that's really great about Einstein is just how, frankly, confusing it is. It does everything, right? It's artificial intelligence. It's API endpoints to do artificial intelligence on machine learning or image recognition. There's features being baked into Service Cloud and Sales Cloud. There's discovery tools for analytics. Einstein is just massive. But one of those features being baked into the platform are the next best actions. So again, your sales team is being surfaced recommendations and suggestions. You could probably win this deal if you do this, or if you add this discount or add this +1 onto the deal, it might mean something better for you, as opposed to that individual going in and doing the research and trying to figure these things out. It's using more of the analytics side. Of course, we can always fall down on the development side, the real development, where a lot of these tools are, everything on the left-hand side is very declarative, meaning you can do it all under the setup menu, no problem. Now, they will have certain limitations. Sometimes you want to get more complex. You need to work with other things. And that's where things like writing Apex triggers will come into play. Apex being the coding language that runs on the back end of Salesforce. And invocable methods are going to be those things that you can have other things call. So, for example, a Lightning process builder process that we're going to build out could say, all right, I need to do the things that I can go through the setup menu, like create a task or update some records, but then I need to do something really fancy. That invocable methods is going to be a way for us to write some additional code to do something really cool, probably more advanced than what you can do under the setup menu with just some clicks. So again, just always keep in mind, it's going to be the what are we looking for, and when that thing happens, what do we want to happen? So tonight, rather than focusing on all of those, there's plenty of content just to stick with on these first two. I'll build up a use case scenario in the financial services industry where we can really leverage a lot of these. And so tonight, we're just looking at workflow, process builder, and flows. And I'm saying that you're building up a condition. You're looking for certain requirements on a field to be met before you do something. What are those things that we can do? So on workflow, the legacy things that have been around forever, the staples for a lot of businesses, you can create and assign tasks to an individual. You can trigger email alerts, send email notifications, use email templates, and update a record, and that person gets an email, or a group gets an email. Field updates, maybe you make certain changes on a record, is going to cause certain fields to be updated to other values, saving you a few additional steps. We're going to be focusing a lot on the field updates today. There's also a fourth one, a lesser commonly used one called outbound messages. And that's a way for Salesforce, through a workflow rule, to send a message to an external system that's outside of Salesforce using web services and APIs. Not commonly used, but I feel like it's kind of ahead of its time, and now it's kind of surpassed in other ways. Now, process builder, I was saying, is kind of in a way, a successor to workflows. It does the same exact things, except for that outbound messages piece, and a little bit more. So a process builder, you can see we have a lot more actions. We're not just limited to creating tasks. We can create nearly any record, whether it's standard out of the box or custom. It doesn't really matter. We can post to chatter. We can post to individuals. We can post to groups. We can post to the chatter wall of the record that we triggered. We have quick actions, things that you're used to clicking on records through the Lightning experience. Engagement with QUIP documents, custom notifications, surveys, more Salesforce-specific features. Submit for approval using those approval processes. We can call some more Apex. Starting a flow is very interesting because we're also going to do that. We want to do something else that I'll explain in our scenario here in a second. And then we have those invocable processes. Now, flows are a little bit different. I always like to say, it's giving you that ability to be a developer without being a developer. You're not actually writing code, but a lot of the principles and the foundation of coding applies here. As a visual tool where you're clicking and dragging, you're working with blocks that represent maybe a record or a group of records, and you're putting them through decision trees. You're working with variables, going through loops, ultimately updating records, creating records, doing a lot more things, even kicking off other processes. The nice thing about all these, as we'll see tonight, is you can daisy chain these. A workflow can cause another workflow to run, or another process builder can kick off the process, mix and match, whatever is required for what you're hoping to get done. So our use case, what are we hoping to get done here? So imagine, if you will, that you are a financial advisor at any random financial advisory firm, and you are in charge of a client onboarding process. Now, part of that is putting together a plan for your client that's largely around, one part of it could be, what properties does that person own? What's the address, so you can look up what is that property estimated to be valued at. So your onboarding process is, we'll create a record, I look at the address, I populate it, I go into another system, I try to get that value. We'll see in a second. It's click, 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 over and over and over again. Where if I have one client, maybe it's manageable. Two, it doesn't scale well when you have a lot of clients, because as you're doing it, your information is probably immediately stale after you enter it into the system. So it's entirely up to you to do the job. You're introducing the more clicks, obviously the more prone you are to different errors or accuracy. And again, staying on top of it. So next month when you're doing a review with a client or an annual client review, I hope it's up to date. I hope you were able to stay on top of it. So today, what our objective is to walk through that scenario and gather information about that client so we can put it into the system in a way that's going to become more reliable, more sustainable through time. We're going to minimize that time that we're spending on working with actual client records so we can spend it with that client. And after all, everything in the platform, once it's in the platform, you can use all those other features. We're just talking about a small sliver of process automation. But if you think of other things like analytics on the dashboards and reporting side, third-party apps from the App Exchange, once it's in Salesforce, there's so much more you can do with it, including Einstein. So thinking through that use case that we're talking about here, I'm the financial advisor. I am assigned a new client. I have to create that record in Salesforce. Now I log into my browser. I have a window open. I start thinking, what's my next step? Let me open another tab for Zillow because I'm going to use that address of the client to look up what my property value is. I type in the address in Zillow. Hopefully I get it right, but after all, I'm going to get to that value eventually. I'm going to take that value, I'm going to plug and chug it into my record. I'm going to finish updating that record because it's part of my onboarding process, more clicks, more time. Ultimately, I'm going to save the record, and the rest of my team can then leverage that record and go with it. We can definitely improve upon that. That's a lot of clicks to do something mundane. And again, one's fine, but the more you have to do it, the more benefit to automation there's going to be. So if we're going to simplify it down, we're still going to onboard that client, but this time what I'm going to do is add that client property address directly to the record. In this case tonight, we're going to be dealing with just the simple account record and the standard billing address. So as soon as I populate that, we're going to build out automation through workflow rules. We'll have 2 of them tonight. Those rules are going to evaluate and do some things. After that, they're going to cause a process builder flow to run to do something else, including starting a flow, which is going to then work with Zillow to say, hey, I've got an address. Do you have a value for me so I can put it onto the record? And then we're going to save that information we received from the integration back onto that account record. That way the accounting team, or the advisor team that is dealing with that record can work with it all day long. We're going to bake in a couple bells and whistles into it as we go along just to make sure that it's not one person's responsibility and something that we can just automate through all time. So again, breaking that down even further, what are we talking about tonight? Workflow rules, process builder processes, flow builder flows, and external services. External services in the black, just ignore that for the time being. We're going to bake that into a flow.
And a question first?
Absolutely.
Wait to the end, but it seems like a good time to ask it. So what sort of support does the current ecosystem have for robotic process automation? So if I want to do things outside the ecosystem where I might want to replace a human worker in some instances with things like looking up or lookups or train them to go to a specific website to get public information, some of the simpler kind of RPA types of scenarios. Have you seen the current tool set, perhaps with third-party extensions, used in that manner?
Sure. So we'll talk about integrations at the end, but a lot of the time it's these external systems that are going to be able to leverage APIs on the platform, whether it's out-of-the-box things that are going to allow you to work with those records or custom APIs that you're developing on the platform to extend functionality that you're looking for. You can say, I'm going to offer those tools, these services that provide these features. Do A, B, and C for me, but curate it around the need. And then obviously working with that data and all the other features of the platform can be bi-directional if you'd like. As I go through, one thing I want to say, I may just refer to workflow rules as workflow, process builder, processes as processes, and flow builder flows as flows. We'll keep it simple just for the sake of not repeating. And so the record that we're dealing with, as I alluded to, just a simple out-of-the-box account record using the out-of-the-box billing address. But what I have done to keep us all in one record is just add 3 custom fields, and you'll see that on the bottom. We have a property value. That's where I'm going to store the dollar amount for this property. I have a property value status. That's going to be a pick list that kind of controls this process for us. When can I start getting an estimate? When is that estimate being retrieved? When's that estimate valid? And when's it stale? When's it expired? It's good information to know. And that'll be supplemented with the last field, the property value last refreshed. It's a date time field, so as we get a new value, all of our team members know this value is valid as of this date. So on the workflow rules side, and you'll notice I have click paths throughout. Some people are very new to the process, everything under the setup menu. So when you see something like setup, workflow rules, I'll have it on these slides, and you'll also notice it on the bottom left hand of a lot of these slides. So workflow rules, I mentioned we're going to have two of them. The first one's going to help us indicate when a record is eligible to have an estimate or a value. I would probably say estimate and value, just assume the same. When that record's allowed to go get a value. And the rule is very simple. We simply just want to say when that account has an address, and a full address, street, city, state, zip, country. We've got all the requirements that the financial advisor can go in the Zillow and search for it. No human absolutely needs to remember, after you fill in the address, also go update the property value status field. It could have been a very manual process in the past. As you're doing your onboarding process, fill out the billing address and flip the pick list to value needed. Someone else's responsibility, or the next thing on your list is go look for those records that have value needed and go search Zillow all day long. We're going to cut to the chase. The advisor has to look at the paperwork and transpose the paperwork onto the record, filling out the address. The system's going to take care of the pick list. That's workflow number one. So standard billing address and our custom field down below for the status. Now defining a rule. This will be under setup and workflow rules. Show of hands. I know a lot of people have done workflow rules. Good number, and a good number studying for exams. We're still going to go through it. I'll walk through the first one just for visibility, and the second one we'll make assumptions on it. So when you're creating a new workflow rule, the first thing you do at the top is provide your rule details. You're going to see this pattern emerge. It's a name and a description. Provide a helpful descriptive short name, but also provide a description for the next admin that's going to come in under you and know exactly what this thing is doing. Then we have to define when this rule is going to evaluate. And this is another pattern that we'll see within the process builder as well. So when you're dealing with records, you're doing what? Typically creating them and you're updating them. So workflow rules give you the ability to say run every time a record's created, or if it's created and updated. And the third option there is the one that we want, and it's created or updated and meets our criteria that we put below. We have criteria because we don't want it to happen on every single record. We want it to look at the address field, and that's what we're going to define in the criteria down below. So if it's a little bit hard to see, what I have are 6 fields going down the left. Those are the Salesforce fields, and the first 5 of them are going to be the address field: city, state, zip, postal code, and country. And they all have an operator saying not equal to, and the third one is blank. Very simple. All we're saying is all those fields are populated, no problem. And the 6th one there is the property value. That one's set to property value equals blank. We want to make sure that we don't have a value, so we go get it for the first time, essentially. So after that, now you have the rule. Now you have the skeleton. What's the thing that's going to happen? It's time to add those things, those actions to it to get things done. One of those actions, as we saw in the earlier slide, was field update, and that's what we will create here. So just as before, we give it a name, provide a description. Ignore that I did not. What object do I want this to happen? So it's a pick list of all the objects. I choose the object, then I can choose the field that I want to update immediately below. And then I have to specify what value do I want it to actually go to. Now, I don't have anything that conditionally says, in this case, say it's value needed. Or in this case, it's one of the other ones. I'm actually doing just a single field update to say this field is going to become this thing where I use this action. And that action is going to be on the workflow that we just created. So now we're ready to test it. This is what it looks like after you save it. And you can see on the top section, we have our details. And down below, we have our immediate workflow actions. Now, anyone in the room notice what I've done wrong here? There's one thing. You have to activate it. How do you know when you're ready for the admin certification? You don't forget to activate it. That's usually a good sign. So we'll activate it, we'll turn it on, and then we'll test things. I also want to call out that down below, we have immediate actions and we have time-based actions. Our second workflow is going to have a time-based action, and those are very cool because not always do we want something to happen immediately after we update a record. In this case, we're going to get an estimate, right? And that estimate is valid today. And let's just say it has a lifetime of 14 days. We'll add a time-based action to say, from 14 days after we retrieve that value, set that pick list option to stale, expired, something to indicate it's no longer good, which is very cool because now we know we can daisy chain these workflows and process builders. Once it's stale, kick something else off and go get it for us automatically. So to see it in action, assuming I find the right monitor, here's simply what it looks like, right? I have my property address. I don't have a state though. We're going to edit this. Put in the state, and we're going to see what happens to our status pick list field. And this is just our first workflow with one single field update. Save the record, and you can see value needed. So again, our second workflow, we're going to cruise through this one. Creating the rule is going to be very much the same as what we just did. This time we're going to have a criteria set up to be, look at that pick list field and say when it's set to current, meaning we just got our value, we populated it, it's good today, but then 14 days from now, come back to that record and update the status to stale. So same thing, our property value status current. We have another field update here. I'm updating the same object with the same field, and down below you can see I'm setting it to stale. Now, one thing that you have to do, it doesn't automatically assume everything is going to happen 14 days after. You can have 1 day after, 5 days after, 300 days, even hours. So you build these time triggers. You tell it what are the categories of time that I want to suppress before I add actions to it. Add a time trigger, and your options are essentially a certain number of days or hours before or after this thing's firing right now, or any date time field on the record itself. So once you have a time trigger, you can add your actions to it. Now, one thing that I skipped over was you can create new actions right from this screen. You don't have to go under the setup menu and find field updates or tasks. You can just choose on that drop-down that says add workflow action, create a brand new one. It's going to parent itself to this workflow automatically. You can also choose existing ones that are out there. So if I choose add workflow action, you can see I can create new things. I can also select an existing action, which I've already created in that last step. So let me just add it here. And that's another point to make. These things are reusable. Whether you want to use it on the workflow, 5 workflow rules, 5 workflow rules and 2 process builder flows. It's a field update is a field update you can leverage in multiple places, which makes it very nice. It also makes you think about the planning of how you're going to do all of the automation in the future. All right, so we've got 2 workflow rules, and we're moving into the process builder. So on the process builder side, what we're going to do is this time, when the property status is value needed, remember our first workflow rule is going to update that status to value needed. We're going to say process builder, look out for that because I want you to do something else. And what we want it to do is really set this value to retrieving value and also start a flow, which we'll look at in the next section. And starting a flow is that visual thing that can actually help us go work with the Zillow API, get that property value so we can actually populate those fields auto-magically. So the process builder process here, it's just like building a workflow. You have what's the rule, what are the conditions, what object am I dealing with, what fields am I looking to, what field criteria am I looking to meet before this thing runs. But one distinct difference here, if you've been on the platform for a while, you notice on the workflow side, the UI looked a lot different. That's because workflow rules existed in Classic. Process builder and flows were relatively newer. Lightning was around, so the UI is a little bit different. It's kind of a blast from the past there when you're working on the workflow rules, that older style. So when we create a new process, again, it looks the same. You have this pop-up, this modal dialog asking you for some of the same details that we're used to seeing now. Give it a name, give it a description, and the process starts when, obviously this time, when a record changes. You can also cause it to run whenever another process calls it, or there's things called platform events that can call these as well. You have more options on ways to start these things. So this is what it looks like. It's very visual. It's very diagram-based. You always start at the top and work your way down. And the first decision you have to make is what object am I dealing with? We know we're dealing with the account. We click to add it. We choose account. And this should look familiar from workflow, only when the record's created or when it's created and edited. That's what we want here. We'll choose those, and now account's populated. We move down the line. Now we need to add that criteria. And we know from the last slide that we're looking for that certain status on the pick list. So we'll add the criteria. And this is what that screen looks like. We give it a name. We want to tell it when these conditions are met. And the conditions are very simple. Again, just look for the field, our property value status field. And when it's at the value needed, go ahead and do the thing. Now conditions, we didn't really talk about this on the workflow rule, but this is very simple. It's one field. On the workflow rule, we had 5 address fields, and you had to have every single one. There's other times where you have something more complex where it might be conditions 1 and 2, or 1 or 2, or 1 and 2, and maybe 3 or 4 and 5, whatever it may be. You can control that logic. In advanced, this is a little bit different from workflow as well, but this is very important to know, this checkbox. What this means is without checking this, every time that record is set up and meets that criteria, if you change anything else on the record, it's going to cause this thing to run. Typically don't want that. There's some use cases, but sometimes it's just going to cause that thing to run over and over and over again. We only want this to run when the record didn't meet the criteria and now meets the criteria. And that's what that checkbox is going to do for us. So now we've got our criteria. we're going to add an action. And just like workflow rules, right, we have immediate actions and we have some time-based ones. Again, I can choose an existing, but I want to illustrate that on one of those first slides, we saw we could only do 4 things with workflows, but on Process Builder, here's a list that we can choose from, a lot more. Creating records, email alerts, we are going to start a flow. We can work with Quip and custom notifications and update records, all sorts of things. So we'll choose flow. And once we choose flow, again, we'll give it a name because it's going to show up in our diagram. And we choose a flow. So disclaimer here, in real life, I'd create the flow first and then tell the process builder to call it. For tonight, I'm stepping this as we'd execute it. So strap in, we'll get into the flow in a second, and it's going to be called property value get estimate. Now with it, what's really cool about flows is I can give flows more information. It can have certain inputs. And for our flow, because it's going to be the thing responsible for going out to Zillow, it has to know the address. So I can give it each individual address field, fine, or I can just give it the whole account, why not? Who knows what I'm going to use in the future. Today I'm using 5 fields, I might use 20 in this flow tomorrow, but I might as well just send over one object, one record, and that be the account. So we'll see when we build out the flow, we can put it's a variable in development speak, it's just a bucket that you're going to put something in so you can reference it in your flow and do something with it. We're going to call that triggered account. And from my process builder process, it knows what account I was on that triggered this process builder. So it's going to take that account and put it into that variable for me in the flow. And in this portion of the process builder, that's all we're doing. We're saying when it happens, start that flow, and that flow is expecting to know an account. This is the account that you're dealing with. So we have our immediate actions, and just calling out, you can do your time-based actions here. Now, some of you are probably thinking, why even do the workflow to begin with? Yeah, I mean, if the shoe fits, do it. It works for tonight, but if you build this in real life, you might do it all in one process. I'd recommend that you probably do, because one of the benefits of a process builder over workflow, if you have multiple workflow rules on an object, you have no way of controlling which one's going to happen first. But a process builder, you can see here that we have multiple lines here. We have our first condition, property value needed. It's going to do its thing. It says stop at the end, but we could say keep going on, move on to the next one, and add more criteria. And we have full control if we have one process builder for that object, what order are things happening. It might be very important if your process is dependent on step 1 happening before step 2. Step 2 happens before step 1, good luck. So again, you can do this over and over, add more criteria. It comes down to that planning. How do you want to build out your process builders? What's nice about process builder, it's very visual. So a lot of the times I'll build process builder processes based off a pick list that drives a status. Here's where I am, and when this status is met, think of an opportunity stage. Closed one deal means something is going to happen. Send an estimate means something else. Something is going to happen. Pick lists are a good way of driving a process.
Just to clarify what you said, Kirk, so in
Yeah.
2020, is there any reason to use the old legacy workflows other than for backwards compatibility or extend something that you had hanging around? Is there any reason you'd want to use those instead of using?
The general recommendation Salesforce is throwing out there is if you're building anything new for a new object, use a process. Workflow rules, they're not going anywhere, but they're also not being expanded. They're not being enhanced. They've also said that. In terms of functionality, the one thing that gives you out of the box from workflow is going to be using those outbound messages. A quick and easy way to send a SOAP-based web service API call to an outside external system. That's not to say you can't do it through, you saw that list of actions on the process builder side. You can certainly write code to do the same, but it's not on the setup menu. Is there any other valid reason? It's hard to make.
Well, no. I mean, the more you grow and the more that you use process builders, sometimes it gets to the point of complexity where it's actually very beneficial to go to the easy tool that does just 1 or 2 things, and you take care of that separately. We oftentimes look at workflow rules and just say, no, it's just an email alert.
Use a workflow because of that simplicity. Also troubleshooting too. Who's seen an email that comes out of an exception, a problem that happens with Process Builder? Mm-hmm. Yeah, try to understand that rule. It's scroll down 3 times for full page. Nothing's human readable.
They're getting better.
They're getting better. And it's even a harder conversation to have 2 years ago when there were a lot of concerns around bulkification. Can Process Builder handle more than one record at a time? A lot of things would break. things have improved. Is it perfect? No, you have to be mindful of your situation and how many updates potentially can go through this and safeguard it yourself.
Kirk, how many processes would you say you should have on an object?
Processes per object, I'm going to lean towards just as few as possible, but I'm also going to lean towards the side of keeping sanity on the admin side. So really defining it, if it's a busy object, you have a lot of different individual processes that happen, different business units that are using those objects. I don't want to mix them up. Just for the sake of going in and modifying and troubleshooting in the future, it's probably fine to have multiple, but just know even then you're kind of in that gray area of control of which process happens before the other. You have control within the single one, but not amongst them. And again, activate it. This one's a little more obvious once you get through all the building. The big gray button means it's not on. Blue means you got to turn it on before you can actually test this thing. Now, unfortunately, with that step, we're not doing anything really cool, right? We're starting a flow that you don't know anything about yet. So I'm not going to show you a record that's not going to do anything you don't know yet. But let's get into the flow. So the flow, what do we know? We're dealing with the address. We're going to be working with Zillow. We want a value. And we also want to update the status to current so everyone knows, and we want to know when it was based off of. Right now, very manual, tedious things. You can go into the Zillow API, Zillow browser, search for it, populate it yourself. We've been down that road, you understand. But our desired result, this flow, is going to have enough information from Process Builder, meaning the whole account and the address fields within, to be able to use the API and say, I've got a question for you, Zillow. I've got an address. Do you have an estimate for me? If you give me an answer, I know what to do with it. And that's what we're going to build out with the flow. And flows are cool. So flows aren't just for automation in the back end. There's two types of flows. There's a screen flow. So think of a time where you might want some sort of navigational wizard on a record. This would be great for those manual steps that I still need to go to that account for the onboarding process. And I want directions in front of me. Click here, step 1, do this, step 2, do this. Surface the fields in front of me. A screen flow can provide that. You also have auto launch flows. These are going to be the things that happen in the background automatically. We're going to use that because our process builder process is going to call a flow. There's no UI, no one sees it. Flows, again, are another very visual tool, very diagram-based, that always start with a start node. And earlier, you had heard me say that it's going to be very much like visual programming. You're clicking and dragging these things that are like variables and loops and decision trees. It's just how you're working with it. You're not worried about writing the code and the syntax. A lot of the same fundamentals on developing apply here. Is it a replacement for development? No, it gets very hairy very quickly. But you can do some very complex flows without knowing much about IDEs, Salesforce DX, Credential, the whole 9 yards. You can do it here. So when we create a new flow, this flow in particular, we choose our type. We want it to run in the background, and we're going to add inputs. Remember, in this case, inputs are going to be that thing that's starting the flow can give it more information. Our process is going to give this flow an account record. So we need to create, I call it a bucket. I need a bucket to put that account in. This input is going to be a variable, which serves as my bucket to put that account. And to do that, we've got this toolbox on the left. Elements on the left are kind of the standard actions that you can do within a flow. You simply just click and drag them onto the layout as needed and connect the dots. But we also have manager. We have different types of resources, and variables are just one type of them. So we'll click on new resource. We'll choose variable, but a constant might be the same string or same value, dollar amount, whatever it may be every single time. A formula, go look at these fields on the account and put a formula together. Text template stages, all things that can go into this bucket and be referenced elsewhere in the flow. I'm going to be referencing this thing by name. So I'm going to call it, just choose variable. And in the process, remember I said we're going to be sending the account into something called triggered account. So you see I've named it. I've given it a description. I need to choose a data type. Data types are very important. Not everything is just generic. It's a string of text. It's a number. It's currency. Date, time, pick list. These should look familiar, right? They're also the types of fields that you can create within your org. This time, I'm passing in a whole record. So I'm going to choose record. I need to tell it what type of record to expect because not all records are created the same. An account's an account, a contact's a contact, and benefits of each. And this last part, this is important because we have something outside of the flow, the process, that needs to send it in. We need to be able to tell this flow that this variable can be populated from something else outside. Now, if it can go in, it can also go out. We don't have anything going out on this side, so we're not calling another flow that might need to populate this. So we'll keep the second one unchecked, but the first one is going to allow the process to pass in the account. Now, let's see here. We're going to create a second one. This is going to come into play later. So one is holding our entire account, but I'm going to create another one strictly for the property value result. Now the property value result, whenever I call that API, or I'm working with that API on the Zillow side, and it gives me a dollar amount back for that address, I need to put that somewhere in my flow. I'm just going to create another one of these buckets and call that bucket property value result. And that's what I'm going to use to update the record in a minute. So again, give it a name, a description, tell it the data type. Again, currency, we're dealing with dollar amounts. And notice I put in a default value of $0. That way, if this thing runs, a field populated with something's better than nothing most times. We'll at least be able to visually see this thing run. So on the left-hand side of this tool, in the toolbox, some of the standard data operations, create, update, go fetch some more records, and delete records. We want to update a record. We already know the account that we're dealing with, but we're going to have new values coming into it. And we also know that we want to populate 3 of those fields, the value, the date, and the pick list. So when we choose update record, we have to tell it which record. We have it. I'm just going to go fetch it, retrieve it, and say, go look for this account with the same account ID. Pardon me. I don't have highlights here. So the objects, the account, and the conditions. How do I know I'm dealing with the right account? The ID is the same ID as the one that the process builder provided me. Now, this is the fun part. If you think about process builder or workflow, we would have created 3 field updates. Those 3 field updates, 1 per field. This is the field, this is the value. This is the field, value, and so forth. In a flow, we're updating the entire record. That entire record, we have the suite of all the fields on that record, so we can set them all at once. On the left-hand side are 3 fields, the 3 custom fields that I created and showed earlier, the value, the status, and the last refresh date. On the right-hand side, what's going to go into those fields for that record? So remember a moment ago, we created that second variable that holds the dollar amount? That's the property value result in the first one on the top right. And the middle one's unique. Property value status we know is a pick list. It has 4 defined options, current, needs estimate, needs value, whatever it may be, stale, and the 4th one. Current is one of them. We choose that option. It knows what the options are, so we're going to choose that. And the 3rd one for the last refreshed, we can use a system parameter here, a system property of the flow. We know when this flow is running. The flow knows about itself. It knows that it's running today, and it knows what time it is. So why don't we use that date and that time to populate that field? Serves our purpose. So I mentioned this being like a click, drag, and drop sort of interface. That's now on our I'm going to call it a canvas. We have our start node. We have our update record node. What you don't see me is drawing the line between start and update records. The more nodes you have, the more you have to connect. If you have any sort of decision tree or loops, lines start going everywhere, and it becomes a chore of organizing what's on your canvas. Smaller is very obviously easy to maintain here. We save it. Again, name, description, and activate. And we're ready to show. So what is going to happen here? Same as before, missing the state. We're going to see that first workflow kick off. It's going to cause the process builder process to kick off, which starts the flow. The flow is going to update that record. And remember, we're updating those 3 fields. We gave it a default value, 0. We told it to update it to current and also give it the right time and date. Video recording won't be accurate, close. And so in theory, it works. Now that time-based, we haven't seen anything about that. That thing that's going to happen in 14 days. How do you test that, right? You told it to do something in an unreasonable time frame to know with any certainty without that time passing that it's actually going to work. So what I typically do, you can do a smaller time period and just update the time period later. That's okay. You can also go under the setup menu and do time-based workflow. You have some evidence of it being fired. You don't know what it's going to do, but at least you know that it's queued up. So when I updated that record through that flow with current, that's where our second workflow kicked off, created that time-based action. You go to this screen, it's going to list all the future-facing things, those actions that are driven from workflows or process builders that are scheduled to happen. Well, that's interesting, right? What if you go in that record and you update it further? You invalidate it. Is this thing still going to run? It won't. If you break the conditions of the workflow or the process builder, it's going to remove itself from here. It now might meet the eligibility for another piece of automation. So it doesn't make sense for this thing to still happen. I very well preemptively could go in and manually fill in those fields. And now 14 days, which is now 7 days or 5 days, whatever it may be, I get an extra 14 days. I'm going to cause that workflow to kick off myself. There's no need for that automated one to happen any longer.
question about that.
Yeah.
Just curious about how people deal with, one of the drawbacks in Process Builder, if you edit, well, not really edit it, you create a new version, deactivate the old one, scheduled actions now won't continue to check the status or whether or not it still meets the criteria, and they'll just fire off whenever they were scheduled for it. So, this is very annoying. You just have to be very careful about that. You can check whether or not, you can clear them.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. It just seems like it's not a great, I don't know what the good workaround is for that. I do want to move everything to processes.
Yeah, it's a heck of a lot of due diligence to stay on top of it. If you're making a change to that, creating a new version, being aware of what is out there. Anyone have any thoughts or ideas around that? I'll throw it out to the group. We're essentially talking about something scheduled to happen, but we probably have a new successor in what should happen when that thing happens. So that time-based one
Even
is
if
going
you
to use
change
old.
that node, you just deactivate the process and then you create a new version of it. Maybe a small change, doesn't matter. Any scheduled workflows now will no longer check whatever their criteria were. And they'll just fire whenever they're scheduled to fire. It's a pain.
Yeah.
And then when you realize it happens, you're like, oh.
All those records, you just hope you have a small queue. No, it's something worth looking into. And so I'm sure we can post something to the group if anyone has any ideas or use the community there. It's a good one.
I would say ideally put this in the sandbox first. So hopefully if you do know what touch points are going to be affected by it, you can hopefully reach out to the people and let them know.
Here's the potential.
Do it manually and create some tasks for them or something that they can follow up.
An extra step in your rollout process. I'm
I'll
about to
offer
do this.
In managing some larger enterprise footprints, that there's a non-technical solution to that around how you perform your business analysis and the kind of meta model that you fill in when you're building these things. Any workflow that you're building should have a record in some sort of system, which you can store as records in Salesforce or Office 365 or Smartsheet or some sort of list, so that you can see in this relational meta model that I have these workflows dependent on these sets of criteria, and you can do a quick filter and search, set these things up, and it's fairly easy to do so. And then before you make that change, you can see what the impact is going to be, and then make a decision. Oh, I better break these connections before I build this new thing, or add logic into this new component to circumvent it. And then it's without having to put additional complex pieces of technology. And just because you've managed all your meta information, you can just avoid that before you even get there.
I think that's fair. And the inverse is probably also true. Populating data or updating data that already exists, causing more to run, you're going to do the same sort of due diligence to make sure you're not causing more harm by updating those records that might be coming from other systems or whatever it may be.
I have an answer for the question with the time-based. It's true that if it's a process that's only checked when the record's created, that it won't recheck the time-based piece of the process builder. But if it's a check that created or edited in process builder, it will automatically remove it from the queue and work just like workflow.
Right, normally,
Workflow
yes.
time-based,
But if you deactivate, because if you deactivate that
The
process.
deactivation piece? Okay, so maybe I
And
misunderstood that.
then because you add a new node, and you want to add another part of the process, and so you create a new version. I understand technically why they did that, but it just means you have to be careful and check your actual list of scheduled. What is the name of it? Sort of like flow. Oh, I forget the name of it.
Time-based action.
Time-based, right? You look at what's queued up, basically. And you just decide whether or not it matters or.
Is this a thing that is time-based and point in time that running is going to be harmful because it doesn't reflect the process then?
Yeah, and
Gotcha.
Contacts you and move on that.
I've thought that it's a best practice to keep your time-based process builder, time-based actions on process builders in a separate process builder than your other non-time-based
That's
ones, so
true.
that you can edit them
That's true.
without having to worry about them.
And you're adding extra process builders. Not a good habit.
But there's only
Yeah,
two.
the trade-offs.
For that
Yeah.
one. And then for any of your other processes that you need, if they can get ugly.
Can I just ask you to reconfirm and make sure that I'm following exactly? So V1 of a process builder had time-based actions in it, and a bunch of them have run. Are you saying when you disable V1, it terminates all of those queued processes?
No, what it does is, so let's say you have a process that checks whether or not the stage is negotiation, or whatever, it checks, it says if it's negotiation in 14 days, right, fire this email, let's say something like that, right? So normally, Salesforce will check that stage, right, at 14 days, right, and check if it's still the case. If you deactivate the process, you create a new version, it never checks, it just fires at 14 days.
Because those actions are still connected with version 1,
Those,
which is no longer,
No longer. Until unless the criteria changes, you will not remove from the queue.
it will not remove it from the queue, even if you did change the stage.
You can delete them.
Yeah, that's what I do.
It's a manual process.
And so it's basically, it's up to your due diligence to, if you're editing a process that has scheduled actions, you have to check that list.
Which is why it's kind of funny, that can be part of your change control if you document it properly. Because then you just run a query and you say, oh, I'm about to create version 2. Version 1 has all these time-based actions.
I need to
better go
recreate.
terminate them, and then I can even automate that based on the script.
Awesome question. Someone's going to go out there and test it. I know it.
But I have more. No, I'm just kidding.
Mike, I'll deal with you later. Anyone feeling kind of robbed, cheated on that $0 amount that we just put on the record? Like we didn't really get a real amount, right? So where's the integration piece come into play? We kind of spoofed it at this point. How do we actually use that Zillow API? So let's talk integrations a little bit. So there's no arguing at this point that the platform is pretty powerful. We saw process automation. We saw workflow, process builder, yada, yada, 900 other things. Didn't even get to the other things that are out there, but it all revolves around your data records, right? And so you can extend the value of the platform by having more data in or offer that data out to external systems, right? And we have tons of ways of doing those. Historically, building out integrations on the development side using the APIs, the standard out-of-the-box ones, or your homebrew writing Apex, whether it's REST or SOAP. That's the bread and butter. That's a lot of fun for me. Those are really fun projects, considering source and destination, the mapping, the translation that has to occur.
It's
But
just sick, Kurt.
it's too many fun Saturdays. I'll call you next time. It's the type of work, it's a lot of consideration, the amount of records that you have to flow through. It's how do these two systems that aren't created or maintained by the same vendors going to work with each other. So development, you always have those options. There's plenty of them. We're going to jump to the right-hand side, the external data loader. People use data loader. Everyone's used data loader, I assume. Anyone that's done admin work has to get data out or data back in. It's the tool that Salesforce provides. Did you know that you can also tie that to a Windows scheduled task and let it run in the back end? I don't know if it's still a good idea, but 10 years ago, that was the coolest thing in the world. I want all these cases to do something. I want to back it up. That scheduled task on the server was great. Nowadays, DBM, a great way of extending Salesforce objects as database tables in SQL. MuleSoft, a recent acquisition on the Salesforce side, a nice, there's a UI that's going to help you map these things out and make these decisions. There's a ton of these ETL tools out there. Recently, we have things like external services and external data sources and remote objects. I'm going to start with the bottom one with the external data sources and remote objects. Not all your data necessarily has to live within Salesforce. We know that Salesforce has limits to how many records, depending on your licenses and the type that you have. And sometimes certain processes can build out a lot of records. It's transactional things that are going to be generating tens, hundreds, thousands of records every day. It's going to get expensive in the platform relatively quickly. What if there's a way that could be off-platform, hosted elsewhere, burning up someone else's server space, but still accessible from your users as if it were a custom object? That's the idea behind external data sources and remote objects. You get the benefits of the Salesforce UI without the cost of having that data on platform. There's some limitations, but in theory, that's what it is. External services. Now, external services are going to be a way, instead of writing all this code to do that integration, working with an API that offers certain endpoints that do certain things, to declaratively through the setup menu create something that you can access through a flow, for example. And so our example tonight, Zillow, we have one thing that we wanted to do. Assuming that the Zillow API can get us a value based off of an address, we want that sort of functionality in a place that an admin can add to a flow or multiple flows wherever possible. Now, the Zillow API does a bajillion other things, and depending on how much you want to expose into your org, really controls how much you build out this external service. You can pick and choose. You can do one, or you can do all if you want. So now it becomes if you remember on the flow where we're clicking and dragging those actions onto our canvas, it becomes a new action type that we can choose. And instead of doing something like create a task or send an email, now we're saying, go get an estimate from Zillow. Pretty cool. We'll build that out. So there's a lot here. This is going to be borderline complex. It's not to say declarative, you can't do these things, but it's going to get very, very complex very quickly. It's a simple use case, but there's certain hoops that you have to jump through that aren't going to be very intuitive. At the end of the day, you're still working with someone's API. Not all APIs are created equal. So again, here, the benefits I want to point out, because you're leveraging those external APIs. It might be home-brewed systems, in-house systems. It could be other systems that you have paid licenses to use. It could be another Salesforce org if you wanted to. They're admin configurable. And I say low, no code. There's one chunk here that is a little bit messy if the API doesn't provide you something, and that what they provide is like a blueprint. We'll talk about that in a second. So how do you know if an external service is going to be beneficial to you? Well, first thing first, review the API documentation. For admins that don't do a lot of development or you've never worked with an API, I hope to demystify it a little bit for you. There's a lot there. There's a lot of information. They can do a lot of things, and the syntax can be a little intimidating. But at the end of the day, if you're thinking about APIs and it's new to you, it's question and answer at the end of the day. I always compare it to your digital home assistants, whether it's an Alexa or a Siri, whatever it may be. Think about what and how you engage with it. You're asking a question or you're asking it to do something for you. You have a purpose and you're providing it some more detail, and it's going to give you an answer, hopefully. And that's what an API is. An API can have one or more questions that it can answer, and it's going to have requirements for those questions. When you ask Siri to, navigate to CRM Science HQ, you didn't just say navigate to that place I'm going. You had to tell it where you're going. That's an input. It gave you an address as an output. So sometimes you don't have those, sometimes you do. And that's all an API at the end of the day is. It's one system, one backend system, talking to some other system's Siri. So first things first, does Zillow have an API? Check that out. Did my due diligence? Most certainly do. Does the API have an endpoint? Can I ask you the question that I'm interested in? Can you give me an estimate based off an address? Cool, it can. We're good to go. Now, do I need to authenticate to this API? And that's going to be something that you need to look into. Not every system's open for anyone to use without authenticating. Sometimes you have to be a paying subscriber to use their services. Sometimes they have to provision you certain API keys, and you have to have those. There's a lot of considerations there. So looking at it and looking at what options exist are going to be beneficial. We have to do some setup there to, if it fits certain criteria. OAuth is a name that you're going to hear commonly. OAuth is going to be that thing that pops up and says, hey, you're logging into this new website for the first time. Do you want to use Salesforce, Google? You don't have to actually create a new account, but you can use an account you already have. That, in a bubble, is OAuth. There's an API key methodology. There's different ways. You want to know what it is, so you can say, can I configure this on the Salesforce side? And authentication schemes are exactly what I was just talking about. Is it API key or OAuth or something else? Now, do they provide a service schema? You're going to be faced with this API documentation that is tons of pages and looks very complicated. And again, it's just the blueprint. It's like the instruction manual for Alexa. What questions can I ask? What are the cool things I can do with you? Just more technical. And the service schema is a way of saying, here's that blueprint. Here's that instruction manual that your system can absorb and just use. When they have it, it's extremely nice. It's everything they can do. And now you can make that readily available and very quickly available to your admins. If they don't have it, it's not the end of the world. You can create it, but now you're kind of translating that API documentation into that blueprint. That JSON language is going to look a bit different. It's based off of something for developers in the room called Swagger. And so Swagger is going to say, here's the service, here's the important URLs that I'm going to be pointing at. That's a different URL to get an estimate by an address as it is to give me all the cities in, or give me all the neighborhoods in this zip code. another Zillow API that you can use. So it can be very complex. It's also where you're going to define what those questions are, what you're going to provide as inputs, to navigate to the CRM Science headquarters. You have to tell it, and it has to know that that is required. And you have to also define what you're going to get back. So sometimes I'm just going to get a dollar amount. Sometimes I might get an error message. You have to plan for that as well. So understanding that, and when you have a service schema, again, when you have those, great. I'll list where I've already listed, and definitely at the end, a Trailhead module that will give you one that has this available. So you can see what it looks like. You don't have to create it. You can kind of test drive this for yourself. So the authentication side, the first thing that you need to do is set up the Authentication Provider. This is something else that happens in Salesforce. It's called Auth Provider. Under the setup menu, it is abbreviated. So if you're not seeing it, Auth period. It's how an org connects to an external system. It's really that plumbing of Salesforce knows of various external systems if you configure it. So one that you can draw a comparison to, has anyone set up the Google Drive integration where you're under files and instead of uploading from your local computer, you can use Google Drive and navigate to it? If you have, that's what, this is essentially telling Salesforce how to connect to your Google Drive. It's the declarative solution for working with that external system. It's going to handle all the authentication bits for you. It's going to do that first-time authentication. It's going to make sure you have all the necessary tokens. It's going to make sure you're refreshed and always logged in until you're revoked down the road. It's also going to handle permission scopes. What can Salesforce, on behalf of your user, get access to? So in the Google Drive, can it see everything or just files and folders that you tell it in a way? So again, you might already use these if you use the Google Drive files. Now there's another piece that sits on top of that. We're talking about the plumbing between two systems, but we have to look at it at a user basis too. You've got a lot of users in your Salesforce org that might use this tool. A lot of users might go to your account record and populate an address. What does that mean for the other side? So a name credential is how me, an individual user, is going to use that connection to the system in regards to credentials. Now, sometimes it's going to be on a per user basis. The Google Drive is a perfect example of that. I have a Google Drive account, you have a Google Drive account, everyone's got their own Google Drive accounts. It doesn't make sense for all my users to share one. I've got some very confidential information that you shouldn't see, and you have your own personal files that I shouldn't see. So when I click a file, it should be the same as if I go to Google Drive in another tab, right? There's other situations where it's more of a company-wide. Think of that financial advisory firm that's paying for a service that all their users have access to, but it's not a per user basis. I don't have a credential to get in, nor do you. We just share the same company account. That's the way that is configured. So it doesn't matter who I'm logging into. I'm sharing one for all my users. It's going to be more of the company-wide approach. But that's what a name credential says. It's either going to be a credential based on me, and I have to walk through the wizard to say, this is my username and password, or go ahead and use the pre-approved company account. Or third option, anonymous. And Zillow, FYI, is. Anyone can go to Zillow, type in an address, and use it. And behind the scenes, it's using the API. So we're going to use that approach. So why do I talk about these? Both auth providers and name credentials, they are requirements to build an external service. A name credential is required to have credential is required on the external service. And auth provider goes into credential. All right, so getting into it. You're under the setup menu, you're ready to create this external service, this thing that your flow is going to call. You are now creating it. As with anything else, we give it a name and description. We're selecting that name credential. Name credential, how do I authenticate? Doesn't matter. Zillow is anonymous, so that's what that name credential is saying. Every user, doesn't matter. Down below, that blueprint, that service schema, some of them are going to give you a URL that you can point to, and that's spectacular when you can. But if it doesn't, and you have to build your own JSON file, when you select that radio down below, you copy and paste and then click next. You're basically providing that instruction. The result of clicking on next is going to be this screen. And I want to focus on the word Apex Actions. Remember on your flow when we were clicking and dragging from the left-hand side, we had a type of action to do something. One of those types is an Apex Action. So everything in that blueprint, that instruction set that is offered by the API, is now an action that we can call through our flow. And within it, at the top here, we have the name of it. What's the question I can ask, as I like to put it? Get estimate by address. And for me to ask that, what additional details do I have to provide? You'll see the second and third one matter to us: address, city, state, and zip. Those are the details that we wanted to provide. What am I going to get in response? That's the output variable. So the response string, or in this case, the value for the property. We're good to go. And that's what it's going to use within our flow. And our final step here is now modify that flow we have that's already updating the record with a dummy value. We already have a bucket, that variable that's holding the value, that $0 amount default value. It's already updating. So if we update what's going into that bucket, that variable, it's already going to update the record with the right dollar amount. So we're going to click and drag that action onto the screen. We're going to use Apex action on the left-hand side and choose the one that we just created through creating the external service. And then as we've selected that, we have additional requirements too. At the top, I'm going to skip over it. We've got the label and the API name and description. We have to feed into it those input variables, the address and city, state, and zip. And what we get back is going to be that property value. So we've got that bucket, that variable that we want to put that into. And we're just telling it, put it into that variable. That's all. So here, now I've got that middle action, that Apex action. I've connected the dots. I've reorganized those lines. We're going out to Zillow. We're getting a value, putting it into our bucket. That bucket's already associated with the update records to populate the value field. So everything should be good, assuming you have a good address and Zillow can give you a number. Sorry.
I missed the part where Flow knew what Zillow needed.
Okay, so that is going to be, remember the instructions, the service schema, that fancy file. It's I call it the blueprint because it's saying, here's the additional information you need to tell me. So it's good for the external service to have that because that definition is the same definition that the flow is going to use. And it's going to say, I had a list of questions, and each question had those inputs. And those inputs are the same thing that we see here. So address and city, state, and zip were the two that were on the external service side.
And you plug those in.
And I plug those in. Remember, the process builder process is going to hand the flow the entire account. And we put that into a bucket called triggered account, that variable. So it's hard to read from back there, but that address field, the first block down there says triggered account.billing address. So that's where we're connecting the dots between the record, the value that's sitting on the record, and feeding it into our API now. We're just using those fields. The top one is just billing address, but the bottom one is a formula, billing state, city, state, country. Don't have much else to do because we just changed the plumbing around. We just updated how a certain value is being set. We're not using the defaults anymore. All we have to do is really save it at that point and then give it a try. So it's going to be a lot of the same, but instead of seeing that zero default amount, we'll actually have what an estimate could be. And putting yourself into that financial advisor's shoes, we're onboarding, we're updating this record. I'm just populating this for the first time. I might not even have all those fields on the layout for them to see. But I went out to Zillow. I got a response based off of that address, short of 2 million. It's current as of today. And sure enough, that current value did kick off that second workflow we did. So in 14 days, we know that it's going to be stale. And at this point, you should know that we can go modify that rule to go ahead and kick off and refresh yourself when you see the value go stale. Or don't even set it to stale, just go do it. So, additional information. We're almost there, aka, where's the API for what time is it? I know it's getting late there, but some tips and suggestions as you go out. Start small, test often, and then build iteratively. That's how you're going to do it. Nothing says you have to build this grand, glorious solution all at once. Start small, do the smallest piece, test it, prove it works, move on. Get familiar with the Salesforce order of execution. We've talked a couple times about you don't have control over certain things happening in sequence. Something's going to happen, then something else. So it's going to be good to know when triggers run versus field updates from a workflow versus a process builder that's also doing field updates, and sometimes it happens all over again. What's that sequence? There's, probably a growing list of 25 numeric items that anyone that's taking the admin test, you're going to have a couple questions about those. But also as you're troubleshooting those things and trying to figure out why step 2 happened and step 1 didn't, you're going to reference this page a lot. Plan around your use cases. Kathy, you kind of brought this up, right? The more you plan around how you're going to do it, the ideal organization of workflow versus process builder, and process builder, your question as well, having one process per process or a dedicated purpose. It's the difference of a workflow rule of actions to perform when the address is populated versus a dedicated workflow that says this is the workflow and the only thing I'm going to do is go get an estimate, right? There might be other things you do when you populate that address, so plan in that fashion. And then if we talk, best practices and recommendations, generally the rule, consolidate and minimize per object so you can minimize the chances of things happening out of sequence. You can do a lot with the design of how you do things. That sequencing based off of a pick list value helps you do a lot more. But when you've got a lot of things happening at the same time, the less confusion you have, the less rules you have of the same type that are going to potentially conflict with each other in that order, the better. You can't always get away from it, and sometimes it makes sense. They're two unrelated processes, so they're never going to conflict with each other. Totally fine. But the more you have out there, the more you have to find and research later when you go to build that next one. The next admin down the road has to know you have 5 workflow rules for the lead object. You have 6 for a process builder. They have to do that due diligence themselves. Related Spring 20 stuff. So there's something new called task queue assignments. We know that we can create tasks with workflow and process builder. Typically, you're assigning them to an individual. Nowadays, you can create and assign them to a queue. The first person in that queue, users being members of the queue, they all get it. They can all work on it. It's one task for the group of them. First person that does it marks it complete. That's really cool. So can we use that in our process automation? Workflow? No. Remember, workflow's back in the past on the classic functionality. You don't even get the option to choose a queue. However, Process Builder, there isn't an explicit create a task option, but you can create a record. And when you're creating a record, just like we did before with all the fields on the left, you choose the fields that you want to populate and how you want to populate it. One of the task fields is assigned to. Sure enough, you can throw a queue ID into there and it works just fine. So keep that in mind. I imagine they surface it to make it a little bit easier, but it's there today. In the release notes for Spring 20, there's a lot going on with flows. So take a look. There's at least 12 items in one dedicated section. I imagine there's more. Elsewhere, there's the workflow flow trigger pilot. You know how in the process builder process we call it a flow? We couldn't do that through a workflow. This is saying there's that potential for a workflow to have a new task, a new action type that calls a flow. Is it ever going to come to life? I don't know. One side of the Salesforce puzzle says we're done enhancing workflow, but here's a pilot that's closed and soliciting feedback. Are we going to see it? I don't know. But it's out there. It's also closed, so you can't get in. And in a pinch, you can see, obviously, the alternative is do it in a process builder process. As Diana mentioned, we'll make sure the slide's available. There's tons of content out there on Trailhead, whether it's entire trails, projects, everything we talked about, workflow through process builder and external services, even fundamentals on the API side. It's out there. You probably have some of the work done already if you're in Trailhead. So that's it. Thank you. Any questions as we wrap up? Otherwise, we're just networking. Christian.
So just one, I got everything that you talked about, but I could see the business user at the end of that saying, now that everything is done through the automation, I want to make those fields read-only. That way people can't touch it outside of that. How would you recommend doing that? Because wouldn't the end user have to have access rights to edit the field?
Yeah, interesting question there too. So a lot of that's going to go into your design. These things are going to run under the user that's invoking. If you cause